Building a company that brings joy to millions around the world can be a labour of love and true reflection of your deepest passions. But as the years go by, you might start to feel a creeping sense of unease, a gnawing question that you can't shake. Who are you really, beneath the accolades and achievements? You've turned a passion into a community and a community into a company. But what can you take with you when you walk away? This is the story of Nick Sabine, the co-founder of Resident Advisor, the global platform that reshaped the electronic music landscape. For over 2 decades, Nick lived and breathed RA, nurturing it from a small side hustle to a cultural juggernaut. RA became the center of electronic music in a way that cannot be overstated. Looking from the outside in, it seemed like the absolute dream job. And, by all accounts, it was. Going to incredible raves, meeting the greatest musicians, and hosting stages at the biggest festivals. But even as the company soared to new heights, Nick found himself grappling with a profound inner struggle. He'd become so entwined with his role, so consumed by the demands of leadership, that he'd lost touch with his own identity. The realization hit him like a lightning bolt. To truly find himself, he'd need to do the unthinkable. He'd need to walk away from the company he loved and the mission that had defined him. This is a conversation about the often overlooked cost of success, the courage required to let go, and the transformative power of self-discovery. Okay, without further ado, my conversation with Nick Sabine of Resident Advisor. Let's do this. All right. I'm going to get straight into it.
Let's go.
Okay. What made you start RA?
I grew up as an only child in Sydney. And I had a brother who, or still do have a brother, but he lived in England. And I would see him once a year.
Older,
8 years older. And he was a international DJ, and he would be booked to tour Australia once a year in the summer, and he would come out. And so he actually introduced me to music from a really young age.
And do you look up to him?
Yeah, hugely. And he was my older brother. He was 8 years older. He was a very successful international DJ. I was falling in love with music.
Yeah, sure. But sometimes you just be like, what a prick. Especially if you're brothers. So fair enough.
No. I looked up to him hugely. He even played somewhat of a fatherly role for me.
Right.
So there was a huge amount of admiration there. And I remember he used to take me to shows from a really young age. So I remember like a New Year's Eve, I must have been 14, 15. And I remember standing in the booth while he was DJing. And if you think about what a sensory overload clubs are, even for adults, you can imagine as a 15-year-old boy, like I was completely mesmerized at that moment. And I remember thinking, wow, I want to be part of this. I was developing a relationship with the music. It was hugely important to me. I growing up as a kid, I cared about 2 things, cricket and electronic music. And they were like my 2 huge passion points. And at one point I realized I wasn't going to make a career out of playing cricket. And so I really fell in love with the dance music community in Sydney, to the point where growing up as an only child, apart from this 1 month a year, I really craved for this sense of belonging. And I actually found that in the music and in the community in Sydney. And I did what many 17-year-olds did. I worked hard. I saved up money. I bought turntables because I thought, well, I love this music. It moves me emotionally. I'm going to be a DJ. Bought the turntables, following in my brother's footsteps, bought loads of records, had a big record collection before I even had turntables. And then over the next year of me DJing, friends DJing, just at home, I realized that I wasn't technically anywhere near as good as my friends, which was obviously deeply frustrating. And I realized, wow, okay, I'm not going to be a DJ. Like, this isn't going to be my contribution to this community. This is not how I'm going to relate to it and be a part of it. And so I thought to myself, well, what else could I do? And I loved writing growing up. And so I thought to myself, well, why don't I write about the music? And there wasn't anywhere on the internet that I felt was really showcasing and celebrating the music that really moved me. And I was fortunate enough to, through the rave scene in Sydney, meet some other people who had infinitely more technical ability than me when it came to building websites. And we just got talking about this idea of, well, the community in Sydney would really benefit from having a place that talked about the music that we love, celebrating these artists, showcasing these artists, and helping people find the best parties, because that didn't exist. And so RA was born just out of a desire to just contribute meaningfully to the community and the culture in Sydney. And what we didn't realize at the time was, by creating something hyper local for Sydney, it could then be hyper local for all these different cities around the world.
As in, the sort of database infrastructure you'd created was essentially replicable because of the hyper localized way.
Exactly. And, it was like pre-MySpace, pre-Facebook, and it had a real community. It was kind of built for community by community.
Yeah.
And it had a real community feel to it. So, every city had its own forum, and different people who loved electronic music would go on there and they'd say, we're going to this party, and then they would meet up and they would talk about the night online and things like that. And so it was a social network before social networks were what they are today. And so we were contributing meaningfully to the thing that we cared deeply about, and that was hugely rewarding. We never expected it to become what it's become today, but it was just, as a kid, I just wanted to be a part of this thing, and this allowed me to be immersed in it in an even more meaningful way.
Okay, so a little interlude very quickly, but I haven't told you. Fun fact. So when I was younger, used to love raving too. I mean, I still do, but now I have a wife and child. It's a lot harder to find my excuses. And I was very inspired by RA back in the day. And obviously, like all young people, I want to go to raves. Can't really afford them. Not that they're expensive, but they are. Everything's expensive when you're younger. So I created a blog called liveravereview.com. And I used to just blag my way. I used to go to every rave I ever wanted to, free, eventually tons of festivals, all just from writing, just reviews of the raves, which is amazing because I was inspired by RA back in the day that you could even do that. And it was so easy of it to set up a blog.
Yeah.
Anyway, just thought I'd let you know that because kindred spirits in terms of, how to get free tickets to raves, well, just write about them, and people would quite like to just, have them published. It's niche.
Yeah.
And you find niche audiences.
And for the first 3 or 4 years, that's what it was.
Yeah.
Right?
But we weren't successful. It was just me, and I didn't actually care about monetizing. I just wanted free tickets to raves.
But for the first 3 or 4 years, neither did we.
Right.
We started it just as a hobby. It wasn't designed to be a global media brand and tech platform. It was designed to allow us to be close to the music that we loved. And so it was never about making money initially. I think our costs were $50 a month. We started the business with, I put in $400 and my co-founder Paul put in $400, and that's the only money that's ever gone into the business. And so it never was about making money. And I think that was one of the things that allowed it to actually develop organically and actually build this sense of trust with the community, because we didn't need to kind of accelerate the growth or cut corners. We could actually just build something that we felt was purposeful and was actually making a contribution to the culture.
If you're an electronic music fan like me, you imagine you got the coolest fucking job in the world. You go to all the raves you want to, all the festivals you want to, meet all the artists you want to. A, is that true? And B, what are some great examples of that then? Make me jealous.
It's definitely true.
All right, mission complete.
I can confirm that. I think for me, it was actually the moments that I had of realizing how special what we had created was that meant the most to me. So I remember growing up in Sydney as a child, I heard about this festival called Sonar in Barcelona. And I heard about it from my brother, and I just had such a desire to one day go to Barcelona as a participant and just see the city and to see the festival. And then fast forward 10, 15 years, not only am I at Sonar, we are curating and presenting one of the main stages at the festival. We've got the RA logo on, both sides of the stage. And we did that for a number of years. And every single year when I went and I had that experience, I arrived and it literally took my breath away, because I realized that at one point I was a little kid who just dreamt one day of even being at this thing. And here we were actually being an integrated part of it, being the international media partner for the festival and actually presenting this stage. And it never didn't have a certain reverence to it whenever I got there. Even after having done it for 5 years, each year when I arrived there in June and I saw the stage, I felt that little pulse in my heart. And it was interesting. We had lots of those moments along the way of, there would be, I remember there was a group called Tyrant, which used to be Sasha, Lee Burridge and Craig Richards. And they would tour Australia, sorry. And I would make a point of seeing them. And sometimes Sasha would play Friday night in Sydney and Saturday night in Melbourne, and I would see him Friday night in Sydney, and then I would fly to Melbourne and it was Saturday night. And then I remember when we did our 10-year series of parties where we did 10 parties around the world in 10 clubs with 10 secret headliners, we had this idea of actually bringing Tyrant back together for one night. And we actually managed to make that happen. And here, like, I remember being that kid again who was so influenced by these artists growing up to the point where I decided that this is actually what I want to be my career. And here we were many years later, actually like putting on events and actually inviting them to come and play and building a relationship with these people who I'd looked up to for so long. And another one of those moments was the Robert Miles record, Children?
Yeah.
Probably the first dance music record I fully fell in love with, and potentially the record that started the journey that I went on. And about 7 years or 8 years into RA, Robert Miles actually emailed RA just about something to do with his label page to say, hey, like, I see you got my label page, how do I make changes or what have you? And that for me was such an incredible moment, because here was the producer and creator of this one piece of music that potentially changed the trajectory of my life. And now 7 or 8 years on, he's emailing us to say, hey, like, your platform clearly means so much to the industry that I want to make sure that the way I'm represented on it is accurate. I remember that day, like, I was just like, it was just such an incredible moment. And it was beautiful, because then I could write back to him and actually just say, like, you don't know this, but your music actually was the thing that I fell in love with initially. And
what did he say?
He was very touched.
Yeah. Like, thanks, mate. Just sort the fucking page out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All good and well, mate. But can you sort that out?
Yeah.
And so it was actually just growing up personally and growing up in this culture in a way that just was filled with these moments of kind of reverence for where I was at the time and where I'd come from. And I just dreamt about, being a part of this community in Sydney. And here I was now a part of this community globally. And you have to remember, we were making it up as we went along the whole time. Like, I remember the first party we did internationally was at the Miami Winter Music Conference, back when that was a thing. And, there's many ways to organize a party, but quite often what happens is you hire a venue and you get the venue for free, you keep the door money, pay all your costs, and then the venue gets the bar. That's like a simple way. We obviously didn't know this at the time, so we were like looking for a venue to do our first event at the Miami Winter Music Conference, our first ever international event. And this is like probably 2004, 2005, something like that. And we get introduced to a promoter there and a venue owner who we start speaking to, and he says, yeah, I've got this venue, it's going to be perfect for you guys, it's going to be 12 grand. And we're like, okay, that seems like a lot of money, but we don't know any better, and we need a venue, we want to do this party. So Paul actually had about that amount of money in savings, and so he actually like transferred his personal savings to this promoter in Miami for us to do a party at this club that we'd never heard of or been to. So we arrive in Miami, and at this point, so we have to sell more than 12 grand's worth of tickets, otherwise we're completely broke. And we arrive in Miami, and the first thing we do is like go to the club. We realize that the club is still being made. There's still people painting the walls in the club, and then the show is the next day. And this is a time also when like people don't really buy tickets in advance. You're kind of like relying on people to turn up to the door. And we get and we speak into the promoter, and he's like, yeah, no problems. It'll definitely be ready. Anyway, the time comes around to the to the event, and we walk in, and the doors are supposed to open in about an hour, and there's still people painting the like central columns in the club, and to the point where like the paint is still drying as people are entering. And fortunately for us, the party was hugely successful, and we made, you know, probably like $12,500 or something, like enough to cover our costs with this, you know, hugely successful party. And it was just a good example of just really how green we were and how much we had to learn. But it was also a beautiful experience, but and not a mistake we made again.
Best party in the world? What's your opinion? Sorry, I wasn't telling you that was the best party in the world.
Yeah, it wasn't. It was a good one. It was a good one.
What's the best festival? And what's the best rave?
Glastonbury, I think, is the best festival.
Agreed.
In the world. Burning Man's incredible, but I think of it more as a social experiment.
Totally agree with all of that.
Than a festival. Trau in Amsterdam, in its time, was for me the best club in the world. That was a very, very special place. And part of what made it special was its impermanence. And I think there's a magic in that. And I think the End in London.
Yeah, that was great.
Back in the day.
Yeah.
Was a really, really special club. And along with Fabric, those two places were hugely influential in my...
Last time you went to Fabric? You passed it, or do you still see yourself...
No, I went last year.
Yeah? Good. Still relevant. You, not Fabric.
Yeah. Hopefully both.
I know what I'm like after I go to a rave. I pretty much plan my week around the fact that I'm going to a rave. I'm like, right, okay, I can probably get through Monday. Sack off Tuesday tends to be the way. And I... You know, even in my heyday, a couple of times a month, maybe 3, but I'd need some time off. I imagine you used to go to raves all the time. So how did you function? Or were you just completely sober the whole time, Nick?
A remarkable hangover resilience, where I used to call it bounce back ability. And it was second to none. And
that's your secret sauce of running this business, isn't it?
That literally was my secret sauce of running the business, because I remember the year before I got divorced, my ex-wife said to me, "Do you realize how many weekends you were away last year? And this year didn't feel any different, nothing special about it." And I was like, "No, absolutely no idea." And she said 37. And
it was 37 weekends away raving.
Pretty much. Occasionally there were some weddings and some birthdays and stuff in there, but primarily...
Yeah, light things like weddings.
Yeah, exactly. And so it really became such a part of who I was. And I was also so energized by being in these environments that I was kind of riding high on those experiences. And I think it also was a level of disconnection to myself that it actually meant that I wasn't fully feeling actually perhaps how tired I was or how stressed I was. And I also I wanted to show people within the company that you could do both. You could go out, and actually going out is an important part of working at the company. Like, one unique thing about RA is every single person in the company is a raver.
Yeah, of course.
So from the person in accounts to the engineering team to the editorial team, of course. Yeah. Like, that's one of the things that we always said from the beginning. We want to make sure that every single person in the business is connected with this shared passion point. And I think that's one of the best things that we ever did, in terms of like one of the best cultural decisions we ever made. But I also wanted to show that we're here to work as well. And so, almost like a badge of honor, I would be the first one in the office on Monday morning. So if people saw me out, they would know, okay, like, he went out and he definitely goes out, but there he is Monday morning, first one in at the office.
You were working. out, but you were also in.
Exactly.
Got it.
And there was I was trying to kind of lead from the front in that way to show that those two things could be combined, and they were both important. And so that was kind of fueling my bounce back ability.
Bounce back ability. So you could have been a cricketer after all.
Perhaps should have been.
An Aussie cricketer. You're built for it.
That would have been. That's the next life.
Yeah. So first 4 years, really just a hobby.
Yeah.
When does that change?
So we were doing it as a side hustle for the first 4 years. And I remember actually being so Paul was working for a design and development agency. I was working for a advertising and marketing agency. Paul in Berlin, me in London. And I remember even actually, and I actually was walking through there yesterday, so I was working for this advertising agency, and then at lunchtime I would meet up in Golden Square in Soho with the person who was selling the banner ads on RA at the time, because we actually had 3 full-time staff working on RA while we were still full-time for other people. Yep. And then after 4 years, we had enough money in the bank account from selling banner advertising on the website to survive. And so we thought, you know what, we've got 3 months. We can always get another job at another ad agency or design agency. Why don't we go full-time and let's see what happens? And then we never looked back.
We're going to take a quick break, but when we return, Nick opens up about the joys and struggles of bootstrapping resident advisor, the painful lessons from co-founder conflicts, and how he learned to embrace boredom, authenticity, and fundamentally change his leadership style. Stay tuned. One of the thorniest parts of managing people is managing their pay. How often do you end up misaligned with your team? Someone thinks they deserve a raise, but you have a different view. This is where our partner, Personio, comes in. Personio is the all-in-one HR platform you need to scale your business. And they've just released a feature for compensation management. It makes salary reviews so much easier because it ties salaries to performance reviews, which also happen to be handled by Personio. Managers can do stuff like see their allocated budget for promotions and distribute them across their teams. Personio constantly adds new features just like this to make your life easier and your company more successful. You can get set up with them incredibly quickly, which is great if you're time poor. So, if you're leading a growing business and want to offer a better employee experience for less effort, then book a demo at personio.com/secretleaders. That's personio.com/secretleaders. There's a link in the show notes.
Building all companies tough. Building bootstrap companies come with particular limitations, of course. How did you deal with that?
I've always been a very optimistic person, so I actually didn't see a lot of the limitations that might come otherwise with not having access to a large chunk of capital.
Typical entrepreneur.
Yeah. Naively optimistic, perhaps. And also because we never had financial targets in terms of like, okay, we need to be at this number to still be, to make investors happy or to do whatever. And our running costs were so low because, our office was at the beginning was a friend who was also running another startup. I would go to his house in the morning. We would sit at either end of his long dining room table and we would work together. And we did that for like a year and a half. That was the office basically. And so our overheads were very low and we would just hire someone new when we had enough money in the bank account to do so. So, initially we were 3 people and then we were 4 people and then we were 5 people, but it was always based on this idea of we wanted to build an economically sustainable business. So we never kind of overextended ourselves and put us under undue pressure because we'd, hired 20 people and then we needed to figure out how we were going to pay them. So we grew it in a very organic way. And I think the world and the internet was a different place back then. We had realistically 7 or 8 years of doing what we were doing before anyone really cared, in terms of scale. We cared, but because we didn't mind if 10 people read us or 10,000 people were reading the site, it was the same to us. Like we were just excited to be a part of it. We were passionate about what we were doing, what we were building, what we were creating together. But realistically, it took a long time before it really started to build scale and the awareness really, really grew. And so up until that point, like the team was small. And because we spent the first 4 years doing it without taking out a penny, we had a lot of other people, members of the community who saw what we were doing, saw that we were doing it for the love of it, and decided that they wanted to contribute and be part of it too. So, the initial, like I always say, like RA is the sum of its parts. Like Paul and I, yes, we connected initially and we had this idea and we developed this idea, but there's been hundreds and hundreds of people that have contributed meaningfully over the years, from the first 4 or 5 years, volunteers who were just doing it because they love the music as well, through to other people who have had, 10 plus year careers working on the platform. Like they've all contributed in their own way. And so yeah, I don't remember these moments of like grand limitations, because it always felt like we were just growing at a natural pace and we didn't have this external pressure to grow artificially or to accelerate growth to hit certain targets. And I think it's very different now. If you start something, other people, if it looks good, other people will look at that and they'll try and raise money and they'll try and do it faster than you. The world was different then. Like we had 7 or 8 years of just doing things our way and building trust and building a community that I think has really helped sustain the brand and the company since then. Because that's something that's very difficult to buy or to manufacture. And so actually I think we started it at a time when it was okay if something took a while to grow. And, whilst we didn't take investment, we invested so much time. I think the cost was actually a personal cost. I remember waking up at 5 a.m, working for 2-3 hours, then going to the job that was paying me. Then at lunchtime, meeting in Golden Square, then doing more work, then finishing that job, then going home, working till midnight, 1 a.m. Because obviously as the project grew, it just required more and more and more of us. And so, I lost relationships at that time because my relationship was with RA. And so I always say it happened so organically that I think if someone had told the 19-year-old version of me, this is how hard you're going to have to work for the next 20 years for this thing to be this thing, the 19-year-old me doesn't accept that. Like, no way. But it happened organically. Like, we just started this thing and we committed to, okay, we're going to do 5. I'm going to do 5 bits of content a day. Paul's going to do 5 bits of content a day, and let's just see what happens. And that's manageable. But we were working so hard all of the time, especially whilst trying to do another job as well, that it had an impact on relationships, obviously, and like personal well-being, because you're so committed to this project. And I guess there's like an unseen cost of that adds up over time. And so I think that's where the impact is felt on a personal level, perhaps more than a failure on a business level, because I think we actually grew in the way that we hoped to grow. We've kind of grown 30% year on year, basically since the beginning, COVID aside. And so business-wise, it's always felt like the trajectory's been consistent and solid. But I think the level of commitment and effort that was required on a personal point of view, that's where there's an unseen cost. And that's where I think actually there's some, in retrospect, there's some failures and things that I wish I'd done differently.
And when things take a toll, sometimes people act out and lash out and have these, as you mentioned, sort of unseen, unconscious behaviors. Were there any moments of shame? Are there any moments you're embarrassed by in your leadership style, in the way that you showed up at work?
The one that hangs heaviest on my heart is the fracturing of my relationship with my co-founder, Paul. If you think of, this is the longest standing relationship I've ever had in my life, because we've basically spoken to each other every day for more than 2 decades. And we became very close as a result of building this thing together. And Paul and I are very different people, but in a way that's beautifully complementary for what we're building.
Yep.
But I'd say probably about 7-8 years ago, that relationship started to fracture. And
who noticed?
It fractured before I think either of us really noticed. Obviously I can't speak for him, but looking back, it was fracturing earlier than I noticed. And I wish I'd had the skills and attributes to be able to course correct that, because I'd say that kind of deteriorated for a number of years. And for me, I think it was me not feeling secure enough in myself that I was projecting a lot of my own insecurities onto him, and not really having the skills or the trust in myself or the knowledge to be able to have the sort of conversations that we needed to have to acknowledge what was happening in a way that would have allowed us to heal together. And that's actually happened later. Like, our relationship now is in as good a place as I remember it being. And I'm really proud of the work we've done to get there. But it's really the work we've done individually. And I think in retrospect, it's, I believe you can only really lead others to the level that you can lead yourself. And growing up, starting this company really young and learning a lot just as I went, I didn't have the ability to fully know who I was or lead myself in a way that allowed me to best do that for others. And really, as a CEO, that's essentially what we're trying to do, right? Build an environment where other people can be successful as themselves and feel proud of their contribution to a mission they believe in. And we did that successfully. But if I look back on my own journey within that, and when you talk about, was there something that I feel a sense of shame for or disappointment? Yeah, it's the fracturing of that relationship, because it's such a deep relationship as a result of the journey that we've been on together. And my own ego in some way limited my capacity to work through that with him in an honest and vulnerable way. I was able to just look at the things that he wasn't doing or the things that frustrated me, without the sense of awareness that actually these are the things that exist inside of me, and I'm effectively projecting them onto him.
But what actually happened? Were you able to communicate the stuff to him? Were you just being passive aggressive to each other for years until it boiled over?
Yeah, I like definitely passive aggressive, just subconsciously and consciously just like distancing ourselves. And I think there's an unseen cost within the business. It kind of feels like, if you look at it in a family context, it's kind of like, mum and dad fighting, and mum and dad think that no one notices, but everyone notices. And that's just not helpful. And, I think great leadership in that moment would have been, hey, like this thing, the reality of this situation is this, like it needs to change. How are we going to deal with that? And, it went on for way longer than it should have. And yeah, and I feel a real sense of sadness.
Who called it? Who was the person who clearly identified that this was happening to create the moment of change?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know.
Were you getting feedback from your colleagues, the two of you?
Yes, we were. I think it was becoming less enjoyable to work together. That was a significant shift. It had been really enjoyable up until that point, and there'd been a real mutual respect for the complementary skills and characteristics that we both have. And I just remember that it just wasn't as enjoyable anymore. And I would just distance myself from him in projects or in meetings or what have you, in a way that was not helpful in the fact that we were growing this company together. And I remember staff used to talk about the fact that there was disharmony at the top, but we wouldn't necessarily, I don't think we realized how present it was or the impact that it was having. And if we had, I think we would have dealt with it sooner. But I look back on it now and I realized that we should have had the conversations we ended up having in these facilitated environments far sooner.
Yeah.
And I remember we used to just go on walks at lunchtime together along the canal in East London. And that's when we started to have these deeper conversations about the fact that, we weren't entirely happy in doing what we were doing and things that needed to change. But I can't remember who actually brought it to the fore, because it felt like a gradual, it felt like we'd just kind of been slipping into a place where it was not good for us or the business.
Were either of you threatening to leave the company? Was it sort of like, look, if we don't sort this out, X has to happen?
I remember at one point I thought, if we can't sort this out, this is not working for me. And, I'd given my life to this company, so the prospect of stepping away, it was incredibly jarring for me. And I think that was one of the things that highlighted how much we needed to do to actually repair this. And so it was in the best interest of the company that we repaired it, but also in the best interest of ourselves, because we'd given so much to this, and for it to no longer be as enjoyable as it once was. And I think also just the pressures and the stress of running a company which gets to 100, 120 full-time people, as people who'd never been in that situation before. That is, I often liken it to a lobster being boiled, where over a number of years the work just gets more and more and more, and the responsibility gets more and more, to the point where you don't even necessarily notice it. And it actually wasn't until I stepped away that I actually felt how much weight I'd been carrying up until that point in terms of responsibility. And so I think the stresses of just running this business also was taking its toll on us personally, which made it more difficult for us to nurture the relationship together. And I think in my own, obviously I can only speak for me, but had I been willing to share that, or had I even been aware of it, but had I been willing to share it and say, like, I'm really struggling here. Like this feels like a lot, and I'm not sure where we go from here. I think that would have created the space for perhaps him to share something similar, and for us to work through it together.
I remember our last conversation, and it feels like you went through a real transition. I want to know what about your leadership style has changed from who you were to who you are now. So 20 years, how has your leadership style changed?
I would say authenticity. I don't think I knew who I was then, and I certainly wasn't confident enough to show up as myself. Whereas now I feel more confident in who I am, and more confident in my ability to actually just show up in any given situation as that person, without the need to seek validation in terms of how the other person might respond to me. I'm more confident in my self-assessment, and actually being able to speak to that, which I don't think I was back then. When I started Resident Advisor, I was only 19. So, we were really making it up as we went along, and I certainly was. And I remember these moments as the company grew, where throughout the year, 51 weeks of the year, I would just be as me as I could be. And then we would have these kind of summits, as we used to call them, where we'd get the whole company together. And, at the beginning there was 20 people, and then at one point there was up to 100 people. And I would stand up in front of those people, and I would give a kind of a year-end speech to kind of recap how the year was and share some thoughts. And I would essentially step into the role of what I thought a CEO needed to be. And so I would get up on stage and I would talk with dramatic pauses and intonations and hand gestures and things like that, and it would be like an over-prepared speech or presentation. And I would come off the stage thinking, oh, absolutely nailed that. That's exactly what a CEO should be. And then I would have people come up to me and say, Nick, who was that? And what I didn't realize I was doing was actually stepping into a role rather than remaining authentic to who I was. And I think that was because I was not secure enough within myself to actually stand there in front of everyone just as myself, just as the CEO or co-CEO who built the company. And I don't face that same challenge anymore. And the willingness to actually just be as authentically me as possible in any given situation, professional or personal, I would say is the biggest shift in my approach to leadership.
How much of that is a function of age and maturity, or the fact that, running narratives through our heads, like, you're successful now, you've built a successful company, so there's more confidence to say, I've made it, I'm a success?
I think we were a successful company even when I wasn't able to be fully authentic myself, to actually fully trust who I was. The company was actually tracking really successfully, and I was tethering a significant portion of my identity and my confidence to the success of the company. So actually, I was energized and emboldened by the external validation that I would get for lots of people saying, wow, this thing's so big and you're so young and it's so great. And all of these things would actually give me this, I guess, this kind of artificial confidence that things were going well and that I was doing a good job. And it wasn't until, a life moment, actually going through a divorce, that I was forced to essentially have a breakdown personally and then rebuild myself from that point, that I actually realized the gap between who I was and who I was pretending to be. And so I would actually say it wasn't the success of the business that actually drove that change or gave me the deeper sense of confidence. It was actually a life event that forced me to self-inquire and really discover who I was and who I am.
So divorce is obviously quite a big life transition moment, a big change in your life. And people move through the change either positively or negatively. It sounds like yours has been very positive, very reflective. I'm wondering if you mentioned just authenticity. I'm wondering if you weren't showing up as your authentic self at home as well. And that's what led to conversations, a divorce, a big change in your personal life.
Yeah, I don't think I was, but unknowingly. So I didn't have a true sense of who I was for probably 35 years. And, the thing that actually sparked the transition was in 99% of people's phones, I was Nick at RA. And at one point I asked myself the question, who am I without this company? And I realized I couldn't answer it. And it was that moment where I knew, okay, I need to step away and I need to make some changes in my life to actually be able to answer that question. Mm-hmm. And as long as I'm tethered to it in a day-to-day capacity, I'll never truly know. And so it was, but the moment of divorce really sparked that self-inquiry that led me to that question. And so, yeah, I think it was a huge blessing. I remember my acupuncturist, who worked not far from here, actually. When I saw her the day after, it all happened, she said, "Well done, you've done this on purpose." And I couldn't wrap my head around it at the time. And I remember that was just ringing around and around and around in my head. And I look back on that now and she was right. I didn't have I think for men, especially men who grow up in, a patriarchal conditioned society, we often need a moment of deep distress to actually break ourselves open and actually start to really inquire as to who we truly are. And it's, that moment was so dark for me and I felt so lost because I identified as a husband and I was central to a great group of friends and I was co-CEO of this company, and all of these things that were kind of shaping my identity to the world, but also to myself, kind of evaporated in a split second. And I felt hugely lost at that moment. I didn't know who I was. And so the rebuilding process kind of began at that moment. And it was, in hindsight, it was a huge blessing, because I don't think, had I not had that level of distress and felt as lost as I did, I wouldn't have necessarily been incentivized in the same way to, fumble around in the dark and find the ladder and pull myself out. And it was that, multiple year journey that actually really helped me learn more about who I was, learn to trust that, and feel worthy in that sense of who I was. And so to come back to your question around not showing up authentically at home, in hindsight, no, but I wasn't conscious of it at the time. And because I don't think I had that self-confidence within myself to be fully myself. And I think what happens in that situation, and I see it happen in lots of relationships, is when we're either consciously or subconsciously playing a role within a relationship, we never fully trust the love that comes back, because subconsciously we know it's not the authentic version of us.
Right, because there's a facade up, you're saying you're playing a role.
Exactly.
Right.
And that can be conscious or unconscious. It was unconscious for me. But I think the impact of that is we can never truly trust the love that comes back, because that we're not being fully authentic. And that was a journey I had to go on. And I am grateful for that, for that moment, as difficult as it was.
We're going to take a quick break, but when we return, Nick shares the inside story of how Resident Advisor navigated the existential challenge of COVID, how he facilitated a change in leadership, and ultimately decided it was time to move on. Stay with us. Are you building a SaaS or venture-backed business? Or are you just trying to grow internationally? Well, If potential customers or investors haven't already asked you about ISO 27001, SOC 2, or GDPR compliance, they probably will soon. Achieving compliance can unlock major growth for your company, but the process is often time-intensive and costly. This is where our partner, Vanta, can help. Vanta automates up to 90% of compliance work, getting you audit ready in weeks instead of months and saving you significant costs. Plus, Vanta scales with your business, helping you successfully enter new markets, land bigger deals, and earn customers' trust. As a special offer, Secret Leaders listeners get 20% off Vanta when they go to vanta.com/secretleaders. That's VANT.com/secretleaders for 20% off. There's a link in the description.
And you mentioned earlier the sort of showing up as yourself 51 weeks of the year, and then the 52nd, you've got your, keynote week, and you've got to present in front of the company and you're a different person. So who are you in the 51 weeks? Like, how are you describing yourself? And is that a good version of yourself anyway?
Definitely. It's a version I'm proud of. I was optimistic, playful, very personable. So really able to get on with people, and build an environment where people felt supported and motivated to contribute to the project. And so I am proud of that version. And it was just a real sense of, and this is how it felt genuinely to me, like we're just in this together and we're trying to build this idea and create this company with this shared set of skills. And that's why it felt so weird when I kind of went into this like CEO mode, where I was kind of stepping outside of myself to become something that I thought I needed to be, that actually throughout the rest of the year, I didn't think I needed to be that. But that's born out of just an insecurity. Okay, I'm stepping up in front of this company. They need a leader, a CEO. So I better perform that role. Whereas actually, if I just stayed myself, optimistic, naively sometimes charismatic version of myself, then it would have maintained that connection. And actually what I'm saying at that point would have landed with much more depth and realness.
So what happened in those moments? It sounds to me like there was a feedback loop that really opened your eyes in that 52nd week, as we call it, that 1 week where things were different. Was that eye-opening? What happened? Who told you that you weren't yourself?
Well, it came after the moment of divorce. I was effectively broken open, but I didn't leave the company at that point. I kept working, and so I would come into work and I would be sat in a meeting room with one or two colleagues, and I was physically there but not mentally there, and I was no longer able, like the feelings I had were so strong and overwhelming with what was going on for me personally that I wasn't able to override them cognitively. And I might just start crying in the middle of a meeting. And
were you a crier previously?
No.
Only on come downs?
Yeah.
Is everyone like, were you out on Saturday? Like, no. I was at home crying.
And so I would find myself in a position where, one of my colleagues, and we have to remember, this is a company where essentially colleagues become friends. Like we're in this together, and some of my most deep and important friendships have developed through people working at the company and me working with them. And I would just start crying in a meeting, and one of them would be like, are you okay? Or what's up? And I was no longer able to pretend that I was okay. And so I would just have to tell them, or would choose to just tell them how it is. And what I didn't realize at the time was that by me as the co-leader of the company being deeply vulnerable in that moment, it actually vastly increased the level of trust and intimacy that I had with people within the company. And there isn't a high functioning leadership team out there that isn't built on trust and intimacy. And what I didn't realize was my unwillingness to show those parts of myself was actually creating a barrier and distance that wasn't conducive to building a great company. And so by me breaking down in those moments and actually revealing myself fully, it then created the space for other people to do the same in a way that transformed many of my relationships, which I thought were good, but they became great as a result. And it was in those moments and in those conversations that I started to get feedback about things like, that keynote address, like, who was that? Because all of a sudden it created space for people to actually give me honest feedback in a way that I could truly hear it and then receive it open-heartedly and then make the necessary changes. And so it took my vulnerability and my willingness to reveal who I was and how I was feeling to create the space for other people within the company to realize that it's safe for them to do the same.
So after 2 decades of building the company from a side hustle thing that is just for fun because you want to go to raves to the largest independent ticketing website in the world, or definitely electronic dance music website, full stop, right?
Yeah.
Like building a really big company like that over 2 decades, I suppose you've gone through all of this work and sounds like you've got to a really great point and you're so in love with what you do and the culture of the team, where you've got to personally. Why leave?
Because I couldn't answer that question of who am I without RA. And I knew that I would never be able to truly answer that question whilst I was tethered to it on a day-to-day basis.
And when did that question first appear in your head?
2018, probably.
Same time as your divorce?
Yeah. And because I'd also realized that around the same time, I realized that I'd never been bored. You have to remember, I'm so committed to this project. I love it so much. I'm so passionate about what we're building. I love the team. I love what we're contributing to the culture, that in every spare moment, I was working. It didn't feel like work, but I was working. So even if I was at a festival and, there was a few hours before the group were going to, go on an adventure or what have you, like I'd be answering emails. Or if I'm on holiday, like I'm waking up early, answering the emails just to like make sure that we're on top of things, and then I'm enjoying the holiday. And it never felt like I was working. Like I was so enmeshed with it. And then I had a realization that I'd never been bored, and I really felt like there would be a benefit to being bored and to feeling bored. And I knew that whilst I was running it on a day-to-day basis, I would never actually have the ability to be bored for an extended period. So when I stepped away, I actually committed to being bored for 3 months. And that meant literally going to the beach without my phone, spending entire afternoons on the couch, not reading, not looking at my phone, not listening to music, just fully immersing myself in the discomfort of being bored, and did that for 3 months. And that was something that never could have happened if I was still working on a day-to-day basis for the company. And then it was at the end of that 3 months that I was like, okay, what now? What will I do next? And
But before you get to what now,
Yeah.
what question did you answer? So who did you find out you were? What happens in a process like that?
it's a very much an inward journey. And I remember actually the one really significant moment of change actually was I was sat in my first therapy session in 2018, and the therapist that came very well recommended, and I sat down with him and I was explaining my situation to him, and I was explaining things to him that felt really important to me, and he said, none of that matters. And I was like, what? And he said, the only thing that matters is your relationship to yourself. And it took me 3 weeks of saying that question again and again in my mind to start to even realize what that meant. And once I did, I realized, well, I don't have a relationship with myself. I've got a relationship with lots of other people. I used to think I had 50 best friends, all around the world. One of the most beautiful things about running this international company, in being immersed in the culture that I love, was I developed these really beautiful relationships with people around the world built on this shared passion point. And but I didn't realize that there was an unseen cost of giving myself to these relationships. Like I used to not walk to the shops to get milk without calling someone. And it could be like someone in London, it could be someone in Buenos Aires, whatever. But I was always just in contact with someone else. I'd go on holidays, never on my own, always with big groups, and I'd be the one organizing it. And so it was a real kind of course correction in terms of like how I do life. And so it was a realization that, I don't have a relationship with myself, but I need to, and I want to. And then that became the primary focus. And that was the journey that I'm still on very much.
Yeah, and I always think there's a really odd paradox that, we're suffering from such a mental health epidemic, and the core function of that is loneliness. And yet the great unlock to finding inner peace and joy is ironically solitude. Chosen solitude, which is obviously a very different thing, but it's so fascinating to me how at the two extreme ends of the spectrum of happiness and fulfillment and despair and sadness is actually the idea of being alone.
Yeah.
It's just weird to me. But I mean, obviously many things are paradoxes in life, but that one particular, hearing you talk with such passion about being given the space to be alone and what that unlocks for you.
And just the realization that one should be alone and one should spend time alone. And for the next couple of years in that process, I actually swung the pendulum far too much the other way. Like
as people often do, right?
Yeah. I went from being, central to a big group of friends, always with people, organizing big events, all of these things, to just literally like always being on my own, hardly ever seeing anyone. And actually learning to really love that in a way that the old Nick never could have imagined. And, eventually got myself to a point where I started to love it too much. And I realized that I needed to actually come back and find the middle way.
You mentioned, you started the business at 19 years old and it grew 30% year on year, pretty much like clockwork until COVID. Obviously, COVID is a pivotal moment for a lot of businesses and many failed, but I can't even imagine when people can't go raving, they can't book tickets, they can't go out, they can't do things, what it's like for a company, for culture, for you, your stress levels, your leadership style. Can you take us back to that moment in 2020, 2021? How did you get through it? What was your reality inside the business?
So overlaid with the significance of that moment, I had already made my own mind up that it was time to step away. So energetically, to some degree, I've already left. But practically, I'm still there because we're just like integrating the succession plan. Then COVID happens. And obviously, that's not the time to depart because it's kind of all hands to the pump. And so
you must have felt very bitter after 20 years finally getting to that moment, and it's a bloody pandemic.
Bitter's one way of saying it.
Yeah.
It was indescribably hard. We lost 95% of revenue overnight, and we are a sustainable business economically. So, we need to earn one more pound than we spend at the end of every year to remain viable. And, fortunately we'd built something of a chest. We had a golden rule from the beginning where we always wanted to make sure that no matter what happens, we had enough money in the account to pay 3 months worth of salaries. So whether we were 5 people, 10 people, what have you. And luckily we'd managed to kind of maintain that golden rule throughout our growth and development. And that was essentially the thing that saved the company, because we actually had a pool of funds that we could use to pay people when literally the revenue tap was almost completely turned off.
Do you not have to do layoffs? I mean, fundamentally,
we did.
Weren't doing anything,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, we did. But we really tried to. You have to remember, it's such almost like a family. This company and the sense of kind of like devastation at having to actually lay off a huge number of people, and we're also, you have to remember, it was such a time of like unknowingness. Like we didn't know really what was happening. We didn't know how long it was going to last. We didn't know what it meant for us, for the culture, for the world. And I just remember that it was basically like every day just being immersed in spreadsheets with our CFO. And we were just sat around and we were just like, the spreadsheets went from the predominant color being black to the predominant color being red, like very, very quickly. And it was frightening to think, okay, we could lose this company here. And through no fault of our own, really. And I remember it was just, every day we were working incredibly hard to like try and figure out how we were going to get ourselves through this, how we could communicate to staff with realness that we really don't know what's going on, but we are committed to trying to do this in the most RA way possible. And then also realizing that the only way we get through this is actually by laying off some people because we need to cut costs massively.
And how did that go?
We ended up, it was basically every week we're like, okay, we think we can survive. We're just going to let go of like 10 people we have to do this week. And then like a fortnight would go past and we realized that the trend was that this situation is going to continue. We're not going to generate any more revenue. Then another 10 people. And so it was kind of done in stages.
Okay, so you did like death by 1,000 paper cuts.
Well, because it meant that we were paying people and employing people for as long as we could to try and manage things to actually not have to actually just like cut just cut a huge, like cut half the company off.
Yeah, it's so this has really been interesting because the conventional wisdom, having been through this stuff myself and having therefore asked a lot of people about how to deal with this, is even though it's the humane thing to do, what you're describing, you're keeping people in jobs for as long as you can, etc. Culturally, it's very hard for a culture of people to keep getting that shock and disappointment, whether it's in your control or out your control. Obviously, pandemic, you do get the extra sensitivity of people having the awareness that is out of your control. However, that sort of emotional, cultural shock inside the company to keep happening, the conventional wisdom is, even though that's kind, actually that's the biggest killer to company culture because it creates just an ongoing trauma over and over and over and over again, shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, versus the incredibly brutal way of doing the opposite, which is you cut half the team, even though you don't need to cut half the team at that point. You sort of take the opinion that this is what's going to happen. The writing feels like it's on the wall about this. It's going to fucking suck. Either way, 10 people tend to react badly if you let go of 10 people or 50 people, right? It's horrible for everyone. So you deal with it once and you deal with a culture fallout once properly, but you at least give people the kind of confidence it's not going to happen again. So this was the advice I was given. I had to do a whole bunch of layoffs 18 months ago. I didn't want to do it and I didn't want this advice to be true, but I asked enough people and that was the advice that was given. And I was like, well, you know what? You don't go and seek other people's experience if you're not going to then take it. And I did, and it was probably the right decision. I'm wondering if listening to this, you're wondering on reflection, well, we can compare. Like, how was that experience? Do you think there's some truth in the experience share that I've offered? Like, is that actually what played out, or did it go well?
I think there's wisdom in what you shared. The difference for us was
other people's wisdom.
There's wisdom in what other people shared. The difference for us was our workload went up because all of a sudden there's millions of people with tickets that want their money back. Right. There's event organizers in the thousands around the world that are also scrambling themselves to either move their shows online or cancel them or reschedule them or what have you. We're having to develop products with our engineering team to be able to do mass refunds, different types of refunds for different situations. So the company's workload skyrocketed in that moment. So it wasn't a case of actually, well, we can just like do what you're doing and actually have this one moment of deep distress and then hopefully beyond that, because we actually needed people for as long as possible, because the moment we released 10 people because we needed to keep the company going, it wasn't like there was that, like the workload that those 10 people were responsible for then fell on the people remaining. And so actually what was happening is the people who were still in the business had to shoulder the burden of work for a company that was 100 people and then eventually became 50 people, but there was still 100 people's worth of work there. And so actually it was a really difficult moment culturally, because there was a huge amount of stress within the business because people didn't know if the company was going to survive. People didn't know if their jobs were going to be there in a few weeks' time. And on top of that, there was a huge amount of work to be done.
Yeah. And they say that growth solves all culture problems. So 30% year on year, for 18 years or 19 years, whatever it is, would create a magical culture where things seem to be fine. So how did culture feel when you kept having to do this? What was it like for you? Was that actually a culture shock for yourself as a leader to witness a different reality inside the business?
Hugely. It felt like it was interesting. There was a spirit of togetherness because there was a real connectedness between the leadership team and the company, and people could see how much it was impacting us emotionally. And we were fortunate that it happened after years of our own personal development and a willingness to truly feel comfortable sharing what was alive in us and what was happening. So we could be very real in the impact that it was having on us and actually share in a way that staff could visibly see how distressing it was for us, and they could trust the information that we were giving them. Because it's also that the communication element in a crisis it's another challenge, right? Like, not only are you looking at the numbers, how are we going to navigate our way through this, but actually what are we going to share with staff that's real, that gives them a true sense of what's going on, but doesn't spook them to the point where they're completely panicked.
Yeah.
And they weren't situations that we'd found ourselves in before. We have, over all the years, had an incredible retention rate at the company. And so never was there a situation where we needed to let a lot of people go or think about how we manage that or how we communicate that internally. So it was a huge culture shock to actually all of a sudden be dealing with essentially an existential crisis. And on one hand, maintaining that optimism that we're going to get through this and we'll survive. But on the other hand, realizing that if this thing continues for years, RA will no longer cease to exist because it's built on there being live events around the world.
When you think back to letting people go, what did you learn? Doesn't sound like you had to do all of that much before, like a lot of leaders do. So do you have any tips, I guess, for people to actually let go of people empathetically?
Honesty and a willingness to feel the feelings that are associated with that experience. So if you're, for example, it really impacted me emotionally, and rather than just burying that, I would allow that emotion to be present in the conversations I was having with people, because that was real for me, and it was distressing to have to let people go. And so actually just allowing that emotion to be present, I think, created a more real experience in those moments. And perhaps it was different for us because there was this big external event and people naturally had an understanding that we were under an enormous amount of pressure and this needed to happen. But I think just honesty would be the core message in that. Honesty in terms of what I'm feeling, but also honesty about the situation and why we're taking the decisions that we're taking.
What about leaving RA? So, you eventually fire yourself, essentially. What happened? How does that actually play out? You had a plan, a pandemic happened. You must have been like, maybe I'm the harbinger of doom. I probably shouldn't try this again, but you go and do it again. So who are you communicating this with? What is the succession plan? How long does it take? Like, how does one leave a company?
So we were fortunate that fairly early on in the years advancing that, we had hired someone as our CFO who we sensed could actually be a great leader for the company. And then he transitioned to being COO, and he was instrumental in the work that we did to guide us through COVID. I'm hugely grateful to him. And so we were working incredibly closely. So his name's David, with Paul, David, and myself. And we were having open conversations at that point as well. And so there was an awareness that at some point I would be stepping away. And actually Paul and I chose to both step away at the same time to essentially create the space for the next generation of the company to be successful. I genuinely believe that the next phase of the company can be its most successful yet, with us having stepped away. And I think that's only possible if there's a full break And so I'm on the board now, but I'm not day-to-day involved. And there's an understanding that the people who are in charge of the company now have the autonomy to make the necessary decisions to grow the company. And in my experience, people work best in a way that I call a freedom within a framework. So the framework is clarity on the mission, clarity on the values, a real understanding of what they're there to do. But there's enough freedom within that where they feel supported by the framework, but there's enough freedom where they know that they can be autonomous to a level that allows them to actually feel that sense of agency and make meaningful decisions on a day-to-day basis. And I think that applies whether you're at the top of the company or the bottom of the company. And so for Paul and I, it was really important that we created the space for the next group of people who were going to take the company forward to actually feel that sense of autonomy, feel that sense of agency that it's now theirs, and how it grows and how it develops is fundamentally down to their work and their ideas. And so the step away was actually designed to create that environment. And obviously having half the company depart in COVID, and then slowly we started to rebuild, all of a sudden now there's an opportunity to hire new people and bring in a more diverse set of ideas, people from different parts of the world, and actually build the company. It was interesting because it was an opportunity to build a company that would be fit for purpose in 4 or 5 years' time, rather than continuing to build the company in a way that was fit for purpose perhaps for 5 years ago.
Yeah, so bit of a rebirth.
A complete restructure out of necessity. And actually it was a restructure that was, we literally, like, blank piece of paper. If we were, after COVID, blank piece of paper, if we were building this company today, what does it look like? And take all the names off and actually just, like, what do the teams look like? What do the structure look like? And actually that process allowed us to make a significant structural change in a really relatively quick space of time that is actually the kind of the core fundamentals of what underpins the success of the business today.
And it's important to celebrate endings. So how did you celebrate leaving? How did you literally leave?
It was very, very surreal because it was COVID. And so the offices were closed. And so I remember being on a Zoom with all of the company on the gallery view, and just Paul and I just giving a speech to say goodbye, and then just closing the laptop and bursting into tears.
On your own?
On my own. Yeah, I was completely on my own in that moment. And it was the surrealist way to close the chapter of something that had meant so much to me. You have to, I've given my life to this project. I've given everything I had to it. I'm incredibly proud of it, but I realized that it's time to head in another direction. And to say goodbye through a screen felt so disconnected from that reality. And
it's almost inhumane.
It was really sad, because it wasn't representative of what this thing meant to me. And so I literally just closed the laptop. I even get a bit sad thinking about it now. I just closed the laptop, and that was the goodbye. And yeah, thinking about it today, it's sad that that's how it had to end, just as a result of the world at that time.
Nick, as you know, big RA fan, big raver. Hope I've still got some left in me ahead of me, but most of my wonderful times in my life have been facilitated by you subconsciously. So, fan, authentically, thank you. So glad to have met you, and I'm very thrilled that we get to share your story on Secret Leaders. So thank you, mate.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been great.